The New York Apartment Law Insider presents How to Tell if an Illegal Sublet has been corrected. Deciding whether the tenant has corrected the illegal sublet isn't as easy as it seems. The following 4 scenarios will help you decide if the tenant has corrected the illegal sublet. Scenario number 1. Subtenant moves out, tenant doesn't move back in. If your case hasn't started and the illegal subtenant moves out after you send the notice to cure, but the tenant hasn't moved back in, consider hiring a private investigator or an attorney to see if you have enough evidence to evict the tenant for non-primary residence. If your case has started, speak to your attorney about whether it pays to argue to the court that the tenant hasn't moved back to the apartment because he's a non-primary resident. Scenario number 2. Subtenant stays, tenant moves back in. If the subtenant stays in the apartment and the tenant moves back in, that's enough for the tenant to correct the illegal sublet. But if the subtenant is living in the apartment with unrelated roommates and the tenant moves back in, the tenant may be violating a lease clause limiting the number of roommates she may have. You may be able to evict her for that. Scenario number 3. Subtenant doesn't move out, tenant doesn't move back in. In this situation, the tenant hasn't corrected the sublet. For example, one owner won an illegal sublet case against a tenant after proving that the tenant had moved to Florida and allowed her adult daughter to move into the apartment with the daughter's family. Although the tenant was given the chance to correct the illegal sublet, an appeals court ruled that she hadn't done so and could be evicted. Scenario number 4. Tenant doesn't comply with settlement agreement. If you end up settling an illegal subletting claim with the tenant, then the tenant must comply with the terms of the settlement agreement. If the tenant doesn't, you can ask the court to throw out the agreement and allow you to evict the tenant. For more on all our newsletter has to offer, including the latest compliance information on complaints, violations, eviction, tax abatements, and so much more, visit www.thehabitatgroup.com and click on New York Apartment Law Insider and download a free issue today.